There's another aspect to this discussion that I want to bring your attention to, and this is the concept of the multiplier itself. Within the macroeconomics research literature, there's a great deal of work now being undertaken, and ever since the global financial crisis, to actually try to quantify the size of the government expenditure multiplier. Just how likely is it that using government expenditure will actually lead to the multiplied increases in equilibrium GDP that our simple basic Keynesian analysis suggests that we could reasonably expect? And like so much in the research literature, the picture that emerges is a great deal more complicated than what you might think from the basic model that we've been working with. And I certainly want you to be aware of this debate. The debate centres around whether we can reasonably expect the size of the government expenditure multiplier to necessarily be a large number. And it's not obvious that this is necessarily the case. For example, suppose that increases in government expenditure put upward pressure on interest rates. Now, why that might be the case goes back to this government budget constraint, the fact that governments are often forced to borrow in order to finance that expenditure. If the government is out there in financial markets borrowing and borrowing up big, creates a significant increase in the demand for those borrowed funds. Borrowed funds, like everything else, represent a scarce resource. If there's a large increase in demand for those funds, stands to reason that's going to push up their price. And the price of borrowed funds is the interest rate. So governments might, through the financing of their increased expenditure, push up interest rates in the economy. Why might that affect the size of the multiplier? Interest rates are one of those exogenous factors that influence planned investment expenditure. We've talked about this briefly before. The availability and the cost of financing influences planned investment. If increased government borrowing, being used to finance increased government expenditure, leads to high interest rates, then investment might be, and this is the term that's often used in this debate, crowded out. You might actually be discouraging firms from investing because the act of government borrowing is pushing up interest rates. To the extent that this is happening, that you're getting this offsetting decrease in planned investment, then the multiplier associated with the increased government expenditure might actually be a bit smaller than what we first might have thought. A second important part of this debate, a second concern that many economists have about whether the government expenditure multiplier is actually going necessarily to be that high, relates to, again, the government budget constraint. Suppose people in the economy, this could be both households and firms, see the increases in government debt that are being incurred as a result of the higher expenditure. We know that that is going to have to be paid for at some point in the future. We may therefore come to the conclusion, pretty logical conclusion in fact, that at some point in the future governments are going to have to raise taxes in order to provide the resources that are needed in order to meet the interest payments on that debt, in order to pay off that debt, in other words. It follows directly from the government budget constraint. Well, if households and firms are thinking this way and associating the higher government expenditure with higher debt and with higher taxes in the future, it makes sense to start planning for that now. And if you're a household, for example, you might put aside extra saving now so that you have the resources at hand when taxes increase in the future. And firms might do something similar. And so we might get the possibility of future tax increases being factored into current decision making. Let's focus on households. If households are increasing their saving now in anticipation of higher taxes in the future, Well, that's going to mean they're going to cut back on their consumption now. Again, that's going to offset the increase in government expenditure. It's going to mean that the multiplier effect is smaller than what we might think. So there are at least two reasons at this analytical level to start wondering about whether the multiplier associated with government expenditure is necessarily as large as it might appear from our basic Keynesian analysis. Now, trying to establish in any sort of definitive sense how large the multiplier is actually an extraordinarily difficult task for economic researchers. It's really difficult because the data we have are imperfect, we don't have that many observations to go on, the statistical techniques we have are very sensitive to changes in underlying assumptions. There are a whole host of reasons that mean our ability to just objectively come up with a number for the government expenditure multiplier, it's just a very difficult research task. This hasn't stopped economists from trying, and there is a huge literature now emerging with some of the best and brightest minds in macroeconomics exactly trying to quantify the multiplier to see whether what governments did in the global financial crisis actually had an impact. I'm not going to summarise that literature for you because it is quite huge, and new results are emerging every day. I just want to give you a flavour of that literature by outlining the conclusions from one of the best-known papers in this tradition, a paper by Olivia Blanchard and Roberto Perotti in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which I'm sure you can find in a library if you wish to read the entire paper, that looked exactly at this question. What does the empirical evidence suggest would be a reasonable number for the government expenditure multiplier? If you do look at that paper, and it's not a required part of this course, it's a complex piece of advanced macroeconomic research, you'll very quickly come to appreciate some of the practical difficulties in answering this question. But I do want to make you aware of their conclusions. From the several specifications we have estimated and different exercises we have performed, and they do go through a number of different approaches to try to get a definitive answer to this question, we reach the following conclusions. First conclusion seems to make sense. When government spending increases, output increases. When taxes increase, output falls. It's exactly what you would expect from the basic Keynesian model. So that's fine, that's reassuring in some sense. But here's the sting in the tail. In most cases, the multipliers are small, often close to 1. There is no multiplier, in other words. You increase government spending by $100, you get increased GDP by $100, you're not getting that multiplied effect. In other words, to eliminate the contractionary output gap of the sorts of sizes we saw during the global financial crisis is going to require a one-for-one increase in government expenditure, and that's huge. They attribute it to the crowding out effect. There are probably other things going on as well, but this is certainly a conclusion from the research literature that gives one, pause to think about and perhaps provides some sort of explanation for why the increases in government expenditure that so many governments put in place as a response to the global financial crisis had to be so massive and to lead to such an accumulation of public debt. One final qualification, and this is actually not mentioned all that often in the literature, so this is something I like to talk about. It goes back to the idea that what we are talking about are flows, and government expenditure is indeed a flow. So it's kind of foolish to think about a one-off increase in government expenditure as being the solution to a contractionary output gap. Because if you increase government expenditure, let's say for one period, and then not keep that increase going in subsequent periods, then it's as if you hadn't done it at all. It's a flow. It exists for a finite period of time. Take this particular example that we have here. So we've got this contractionary output gap, and we've increased government expenditure to push planned injections up, and that's fine. Let's just ignore this debate about the size of the multiplier. Let's just suppose that this has happened. And let's suppose we've done this over a particular period of time. Let's say we've done this in the year 2009. But the government budget constraint is there. We can't keep doing this forever. And so at some point, governments have to perhaps reverse this and say, okay, we can't keep financing this increase in government expenditure forever. Let's take notice of our government budget constraint, and let's just say, okay, we've tried, we've increased our government expenditure, we've eliminated the contractionary output gap, we can now cut back on government expenditure. Something like this is happening in Europe through the austerity measures, where governments in Western Europe are responding to their high levels of public debt by cutting back now on their government expenditure. But suppose the underlying sources of weakness that got you into the contractionary output gap are still there. Then all that is going to happen as a result of introducing the austerity measures, of reversing the previous increases in government expenditure, is you're going to go back to the contractionary output gap. So when we speak of using government expenditure as a mechanism or as an instrument to try to eliminate a contractionary output gap, even within the logic of the basic Keynesian model, that's true. But it's a flow, so it's only true over a certain period of time. If that increase in government expenditure is reversed and the underlying reasons for the contractionary gap are still there, you may end up going back into the contractionary gap and you perhaps haven't solved the problem at all.